First, we'll start by sharing some methodological principles on how we think it's important to engage with our governments, something that most NAV, if not all NAVs, are interested in doing. We identify their a need as manifested by you, to support these efforts in a more organic manner. Then we will discuss how to approach government, who to try to approach, which role should we play as a community, in particular as an app. Then our friends from Mexico will talk us through their efforts to applicate these principles brilliantly to their context. So that will take most of the presentation. Very excited to hear from them. And then finally, before listening to all of you, we'll introduce next steps in the hope that we can work together more closely with many of you from the last quarter of this year and throughout 2021. So if we can go next and talk about the next one quite quickly. One very important thing is that I want to, as I saw Laura passing on the slides, I want to thank very much, especially the market development team, Fran, Joe, Rafa, Laura, for bringing us together, organizing this so brilliantly, and of course Juli and Belen from the policy team, who you will get to know a bit later. Everything we've been doing this year in terms of impact policy making, impact policy advocacy, has been cross-cut or guided by three principles or three aspirations. As you all know, here we have NABs that have been with us for longer. Some of you are newer members. You may be aware that historically the GSG has made quite a bit of work in terms of government engagement. In fact, the GSG is born out of what one could describe as a supranational governmental effort, which is the G7 back in the day, with governments sending representatives to what were then the first proto versions of the initial national advisory boards. And also, we've been working at the GSG and more widely in our movement to derive solid frameworks to think about what does it mean to bring impact to the center of policy making, and more specifically, what should be the role of government in its different capacities to advance the impact movement as a market participant, as a regulator, and across all different sectors of the market. That work that we've done historically resulted in different, for example, papers like the one we issued in December 2018, identifying policy toolkits. A fantastic working group of the GSG led by Michelle Giddens from Bridges Fund Management in the UK, if you remember that paper that we will reference later. But also working together with colleagues in partner organizations like the OECD. I don't know if Karen joined, but Karen Wilson is another massive champion in this field with whom we worked closely together in the past. And the frameworks we've been using are very much aligned with those of the OECD that also advanced a lot of good work on the impact policy space. When we created a dedicated policy area this year in the team, in-house, in the central team of the GSG, we wanted to build on this good work, on these very strong precedents, but perhaps strengthen more three ties that you will, I hope you get present throughout the whole discussion today. We think it's time, and we thought that in January when we started, before the pandemic outbreak. We think it's very important to keep our efforts in terms of policy really action-oriented, going beyond the design to see how we as NABs and from the central team, but mostly through the NABs, can drive real action in the different markets. Also, we felt there's a still need to bring tools, instruments, policy elements, or any other instrument really, closer to the issues we want to work for. Because we feel, respectfully, that sometimes the discussions are way too centered on the tools and a bit detached from the reality we want to change. So we are making a conscious effort to put the instruments at the service of resolving the social and the environmental issues we care about, because these priorities, tools, instruments, vehicles will be as good as their ability to respond to that agenda, which is what we work for, people and the planet first. And the third thing, which we thought historically that we perhaps need to get a bit better at, and that's where the role of the NABs is absolutely crucial, is that we need to be flexible, concrete but flexible, and really context sensitive. Because sometimes these frameworks and toolkits, you open them up in Brazil or in Zambia or in New Zealand, and they can mean very different things because our countries are very different. Institutional arrangements in our countries are very different. The investment climates are different. The social agenda is different. So, action oriented, issue centered, context sensitive, that's where we think the 2.0 of impact policy making and advocacy should be. And that's what I insist, cross-cutting everything we are doing now. So based on those or on that aspiration, on that vision, this year we developed maybe methodology is a bit too much. That's what we say, methodological principles to identify priorities, because in the tools we have a lot of things. That paper referred to identify 15 tools. There are more than 15 tools. But how do we identify what we really want to prioritize and what we really want to work towards? So essentially, we are proposing, or we've been working with NABs to work on the juxtaposition of four things to identify the priorities, which is essentially the ones you see there. Mainly, what are the most pressing social issues we care about? Which tools can be best to tackle that? What are the real priorities in terms of politics and policy for our governments, and how those can be tailored and dialogue with institutional, legal, and regulatory frameworks in each of the countries? Because if we care a lot about something, but maybe the government, it's not amongst their top priorities, well, we believe that the probability of that going forward is less than if we, reasonably cater our priorities to what also is a priority for the government, but also a priority for the market and for the players in the impact space, and also relevant to the agenda we care about, and also doable, adjustable, or that could be tailored to the legal frameworks in the country. So that analysis, where we think about these different categories, is the basis to identify our policy advocacy priorities as a group. There's much more to be said around this, but I want you to take this image based on the aspiration I described before and these four principles. If we can go to the next one. But then it's also important, once we are identifying that aspiration, to see, well, maybe we are starting to identify the what, but then what about the with whom? Who do we approach? So when we're saying, well, let's work better with governments, what does it mean to work better with governments? And who do we pick up the phone with? I mean, who do we want to get a meeting with, to get in a room to listen to our agenda? And it's a tricky one because it's absolutely different in each country. There is a lot of nitty-gritty details to be discussed on this. But if we were to oversimplify the identification of what we would call policy champions, one would say that we want to relate with people who are doers and also innovators, who are influential and they are operational, but they also have political gravitas, and that they are in need of a solution, that they are open to innovation and identify that what we say, the principle, government alone can't cope. There are many politicians and many people in office who don't agree with that. So those will be typically more closed to engaging with communities like ours. But those who are more innovative and that are really identifying that they cannot solve everything by themselves and that they need the power of capital, the power of the market, and that they need to work with all sectors to come with solutions, those are the ones we are looking for. And sometimes, some of the NABs or even ourselves get a meeting with, I don't know, a minister, let's say the vice president of the country. Is it good or bad? Well, it's really important because it's a very senior figure, but does it guarantee that then they will follow and they will pay attention to what we are saying? Or is it like an image and we get the feeling that we reached very high up, but then there is no continuation? Or the other way around, sometimes we engage with someone very knowledgeable, very passionate, very technical, really speaks our language, but is really not influential. And maybe we spend months and months cultivating that relationship, but nothing happens because that particular person, that particular group of persons don't really have gravitas and weight in the political discussion in the countries. And then all of this needs to be thought of which kind of initiative we are trying to push. Are we better off engaging at the executive level? Or is it a legislative matter? Is it national or is it subnational? Perhaps the idea is that, or the underlying feeling is that engaging with policymakers is engaging with the president's office or with the cabinet office or with a ministry in the executive, in the federal government. Well, maybe that's the case if you want to push something that's pending on an executive decision at the national level. For example, if we were to, these are just illustrative, the ones we have in that box to the right. If you're trying to pass, to mandate transparency or to establish a wholesaler, well, maybe that's a discussion which is federal and, depends on the executive. But if you're trying to, pass fiscal incentives, which is, taxing policy, or if we want to promote a change in fiduciary duty, or get a specific legal form like the big companies in Latin America, well, that's the National Congress, probably. And there are other things that we can do at the state level, even the municipal level. We see a lot of opportunity to work with cities, with provinces. So all of this needs to come in place. And this is the kind of reflection we do together with the NABs. This is the whom. And lastly, if we can move forward, Laura. Well, say that we identified what we want to prioritize and who do we want to approach. And who do we want to approach? Remember, thinking about action, thinking about the reality and social issues, thinking about how to tailor that to our local context. Well, what do we do with that? I mean, which role do we want to play, or can we credibly play as a national advisory board? Well, that's a tricky one. And it's not something that we'll be able to answer now. And the answer will depend very much so in the abilities, organization, architecture, capabilities of each of the NABs, and also on their vision and aspiration. And there is not a right answer here. What we think is important is to reflect on this very consciously. Here at the GSG, we like very much a paper that is linked there in the bottom. It's agitate, innovate, or orchestrate. And this describes different roles that stakeholders can take in social transformation. It's a very nice read. I recommend that you take a look at that. Or in the process, we encourage folks to take a look at that. Why? Because there is not, as I said, not right role, but they are very different roles. So as a NAB, or even as a central organization, we can choose to be agitators. That has a merit. And the agitator would put the issue or would, call for action in a specific area, and they would work to do public awareness. And that has to be informed and technical and tactical, and intelligent. And it is a role. Say, hey, let's pay attention to this. And this could mean that as a NAB, we are participating in public forums, we are writing in the media in the name of the movement in that country. We are releasing knowledge materials, we are educating, evangelizing in a way, and that's fine. A different thing is for a NAB or for the GSD or for us together, because the organization, it's all of us, those in the central team and you at the NABs, to innovate, which is a different thing. It's, well, I identified the thing, I raised awareness, but maybe I also want to get my hands a bit dirtier and create a solution. It's not, better or different. Some countries, some moments, some issues require more agitation, more innovation, or a bit of both. Then, if you read the paper, it's interesting the way the orchestrators are described as those who, on top of doing that, or different to doing that, will coordinate action across groups and be a convener of that and driving the change. Well, NABs are also in a unique position to play that role. Maybe they take some ideas from others, they work with others. Maybe the innovation is coming from outside the NAB. Maybe the innovation is also coming from outside the impact camp. Maybe the basis for the agitation were developed by others, but NABs can also be orchestrators. What we think is that it's very important to be conscious of these different roles and think organically around the issue of the what, with whom, how, which role are we going to play. So in the next slide, there is a bit of material around these different roles and the kind of actions that they take. We will not discuss this. I recommend you read the article or then look at the slides. This is examples of the kind of things we've been referring to. But I think for this intro, I hope you're starting to get the feeling of what are these methodological principles. I insist to call them principles in the way we recommend to think very strategically around policy priorities. There are identification, who to work with, which role to play. That's the kind of work we've been doing with some of the NABs. That's the kind of work that from the central team we want to keep playing. We want to keep working with you, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Well, in a minute, not in 20 minutes. Before then, I think there is a question. There is,
yes.
There is a
Thank
question.
you very much, Seb. Thank you. That was fantastic. So having just a question for you, having just heard about those roles of NABs as agitators, innovators or orchestrators, just as a top of mind response, where would you put your NAB? Which best describes your NAB at the moment? So we'll just give it a few seconds for responses to come in. I think we've got one of each so far. Coming up. So we've got lots of balance between orchestrators and agitators. And the code is in the chat, if as well as at the top of the slide. Yeah, do share your response if you haven't. So it looks like just under half of people would say their NAB is in the orchestrator category. So that's interesting for us to see, followed by agitators around a third, and innovators. So thank you very much. So we'll move on to Seb. I think you were going to introduce the Mexico case study. So over to you briefly.
Yeah, what I wanted to do just now is welcome our dear friends and really take the time to appreciate all that they've done with us. Mexico is one of the countries we work with very closely this year, and they took these principles, which really, have been co-created throughout the year with our different partners. They applied them brilliantly to their context. They have in its year a wonderful leader together with Rodrigo, the chair of the Mexican NAB. They had the luxury of counting Dalberg as members of the alliance, of the Mexico alliance. So that was the perfect storm, the perfect combo to take this thinking to the next level. So now we are super excited to hear from them how they worked around this and how they engaged everyone in the NAV to identify these priorities, come together as a group, build a cohesive vision for policy engagement, identify very concrete actions, and identify which role they aspire to play. So we are all super thankful to them for working with us in this presentation, for being here with us. And I think it's a unique opportunity for all of us to hear from them, especially for all the NABs to hear from a fellow NAB, especially important coming from Latin America, where policy environments and politics and the investment climates and the regulation are far from being perfect. So I think the merit is double. And I would also encourage everyone to pay attention to the slight adaptations they made to these principles, idiosyncratically, let's say, to respond to their context, which is something that everyone should do when we start working one-on-one with them. So thank you and welcome Itziar, Marcos, Fabiola, and everyone joining from Mexico today.
Thank you, Seb. Thank you, Joe, and all the GSG team for this wonderful work and all the support that we received. I want to start talking about why we start thinking about this strategy, public policy strategy. For us, this started as a part of a broader conversation. So we were thinking about what do we have to offer, which is the value added that we as NABs offer to our members and the sector, the impact investing sector. So among the most relevant that we identified was the capacity of putting together the efforts and energy of different actors to address one specific issue. And to represent and be the voice of all the members of the conversations with the public sector. So additionally, of these specific things that we identified as like internally, being part of the GSG, a global network that allow us to be part of a great movement, knowledge sharing, and the opportunity to work and learn from the practitioners that started this movement. So these ones are like the key factors or the key things that we identify that as NABs we can offer to our members, and we should encourage and strengthen. I think this is a common challenge that we as all NABs shares in a different levels and in different areas, but how to clarify, clearly establish and communicate this added value that differentiate us from other organizations or initiatives locally. As we said in other dialogues, there are other initiatives outside that try to push or have a slightly closer agenda as we do. So how we differentiate us from them, and how we clearly sell, let's say, our efforts and our work, in this case in Mexico. So when we heard about this initiative from the policy team, I thought like, this is exactly what we need and what we want. We were trying to establish a public policy strategy, but we didn't know exactly how to do it. For me and for the NAB, this project allows us to reflect in a really concrete and actionable way the value that we have as NAB and the opportunity to learn and have the support from the great policy team, and the opportunity to get to engage our members in things that matter to them, and to make them feel as a community and as part of something. Obviously, as Seb said, we have a great actors involved in our NAB, and one of the stars that guide these efforts were Dalberg. They have been an amazing members and friends. So with them, we define and work this strategy. Without them, we couldn't done this actually. So how the process started is like, as you know, most of you know, the GAG launched the Public Policy Initiative at the beginning of 2020, and we expressed our interest to be part of this project. And at the end, we were selected as one of the champions country to develop this strategy. The particular objectives for the alliance, for the Alianza, in this strategy, it's a short-term objective is to identify topics and channels through which to influence impact investing public policy, particularly in the post-COVID-19 context, which may further the development of its members. And in a medium-term objective is to implement a series of specific action lines with the Alianza as an intermediary between the impact investing sector and the federal or state governments, in order to create the political will to support the evolution and implement of Mexico ecosystem. So it was a really interesting and rich process. And I would like to Marcos from Dalberg to explain a little bit deeper about the methodology that we used and how we achieve all the at the end the full work that we did.
Thank you, Itziar, and thank you to the GSG team for this brilliant opportunity. For those that aren't familiar with us, we are a strategic advisory firm that works in economic development and social impact across the world. I'm based in Mexico City alongside my colleague Fabiola, who leads our Latin America work. And as Itziar says, we are part of the NAB family in Mexico. And first and foremost, I'd say that this work and this example that we want to give you today, we don't want to present sort of in-depth the content, more around what was created, what was done in a short amount of time, as more of an inspiration for all of you to get to know sort of how to tackle many of these big concepts, many of these big ideas that have to do with advocacy, and how to make it real for the role that the NAB plays. And so we want to give a little bit of an example of the approach we took and some of the outputs we generated. Next slide, please. So just to walk you through maybe a little bit of the framework or the approach that we took. And again, this is, as Seb says, very much a localization of many of the principles around what advocacy means, around what is essential for an advocacy strategy. And naturally, as us working very closely with Itziar and with the Alianza, as well as with the members, wanted to make this a little bit of a research process that was very much sort of evidence-based, evidence-driven, and that allowed for the members of the NAB as very much a collective to make decisions together. And so from left to right, our basic approach to making this real was a combination of a quick diagnosis, then the definition of concrete sort of activities or action lines, as we call them, and then finally really a refinement process that allowed us to prioritize among these action lines, develop internal capacity and teams of members of the NAB to work together around priority action lines, and really start putting these to play. So what we want to walk you through today is a little bit the approach, particularly to the diagnosis element, as well as some examples of the action lines that came up. And from a diagnosis element, really breaking it down for the three sort of components that we have on the left. One is really focusing on those impact problems, right? The problematic, the challenges, the social impact themes that we really wanted to zero in on, that we thought would get fundamental relevance in our discourse, in our debate, as we engage with policymakers. Second is think about what is that ask, right? What are those elements that we think are needed in our regulatory system, in our institutions, to make impact investing more possible in our local context. And then thirdly, think about, okay, we know what to focus on. We know, what exactly we're asking for. Who should we then engage, right? And the third component is really about those actors and those channels that we would use for engagement. And this all turned into what we would call these action lines that we'll talk about in a second. Next slide, please. And to actually put this in practice, we did a combination of some, pretty straightforward desk research, looking at things like national development plans, SDG progress reports, put together by UNDP, by others, looking at key policy statements from the executive and some subnational governments, political commitments that may have been made. We're at a point now in Mexico where a new electoral cycle is taking place. And so we had a lot of material to work with, essentially. We also leaned on country level reports that had been done on impact investing in Mexico, case studies put together by GSG in the policy toolkit of a few years back. So we had a lot to work with already. I didn't have to generate significant amounts of new research. And the last thing I'd say is, as we did this process, this was very iterative. So we came together and gave progress reports with Itziar and the team. And we had a series of one-on-one interviews with many key members of the Mexican NAB. This was a great way for making sure that we were working towards the needs of the members, making sure that we were accounting for the different perspectives that many of these players had. And what you'll see in many of your own NABs is that you will have many actors that by themselves have done a lot of advocacy. And so it's how do you use that sort of learned experience internally to elevate it to the needs of the ecosystem. Next slide, please. And so just clicking or focusing on the first one, which is prioritizing sort of the impact problem or impact challenges. This is a combination of, development priorities, political priorities, relevance to the impact investment ecosystem. And so we came out of this really with a set of core themes that we really wanted to focus our discourse on, core themes that were specific enough, right, or sufficiently defined so that they're relevant to the investment community, but comprehensive enough that they encompass sort of different angles through which the NABs members can engage. And just one example of how we did this on the next slide is we took, for example, a range of different thematic priorities articulated through the lens of the SDGs. We had a sense of, okay, do they match sort of the core development needs of our local context? Do they match the discourse that's dominating political priorities? And are they relevant to impact investment? And in the case of Mexico, we found the case of inclusive employment, particularly the angle of SMEs and MSMEs in a context of economic crisis and in the context of economic recovery, as an angle that really ticked all these three sort of subcomponents. And so one that we would want to use to essentially open the door to discourse and say, hey, look, we are, policymakers ourselves as ecosystem champions coming at this from a similar angle, and we want to work together and establish that sort of ethos of collaboration from the very beginning. Next slide, please. What we also did was had a review, or performed a review of two things. One is, what is that role that the government plays in the impact investing ecosystem? And this framework on the left, by the way, comes directly from GSG's sort of policy handbook, policy paper, with case studies for many of our NAB countries. And so we used a lot of that really as a core starting point, and had a sense of, okay, what is currently active in terms of initiatives? What is in process at a mature stage? What has been started but maybe isn't as developed? And then on the next slide, we used a similar sort of framework to identify not only what is getting started, but what is fundamentally missing, right? So when we think about the government's role as a facilitator and building an ecosystem, so the top right quadrant of this framework, have they put into play a dedicated sort of impact unit in key ministries that is really pushing impact measurement criteria? Or if we think about the government's role as sort of, a regulator on the demand side, so demand side being the recipients of impact capital, are they, is there a framework in place or a regulatory environment in place for legal forms for social enterprises to become viable and become active effectively? And so we realized that no, right? And so many of these things would be actually very concrete elements that we as a NAB would want to work towards, right? Using maybe this top line development narrative and policy narrative to open the door to be able to speak about many of these different challenges. And on the next slide is just an example of some of the things we heard from some of our NAB members, right? We've heard about, there's been some progress in discourse. In some cases, there are some elements that, have been debated or been discussed, but never really acted upon. So how can we leverage maybe some of that momentum? A few of the things that really stood out, and I'll call out one of them, which is on the left-hand side, which is the government's role as a participant in the impact investing ecosystem, as a generator of demand. Have they been able to put into place an infrastructure for results-based payments, right? So not necessarily establish the concrete details of to be able to emit or launch a social impact bond, but a lot of the necessary background, a lot of the necessary elements that are key for outcome-based contracts, RBF as a whole, not just the social impact bond, to be able to be developed. That got a lot of enthusiasm, and that started generating already some ideas on what we can concretely sort of build towards as part of our action lines. And then on the next slide, this is the third component of the quick diagnosis we did. We had to think about these actors, right? These actors in the market. We thought about everything from sort of the secretaries, which are the ministers of key ministries at the national level, at the federal level. We thought about their technical teams, and we replicated to some extent this logic more and more subnationally, right? From state governors to mayors to their technical teams as well. And we had a little bit of a sense of, hey, how have we maybe engaged them before? What have we learned? What is the dynamic we'd want to take with them? And within the current sort of political paradigm, what is the degree of, as Seb was mentioning earlier, their focus, but also their technical capacity and their influence, right? To be able to sort of accelerate this kind of change at scale. And that allowed us to really come out of this saying, hey, look, there is clear potential at the federal level, at the secretary level, but the moment may not be sort of exactly right now, particularly to push big legislative changes, given the moment of political change, right? So let's think about maybe addressing some priorities with them and planting some seeds for further engagement. But as we start to pilot some of this advocacy work a little bit more intentionally, let's also start engaging with more subnational players who have a little bit more political runway. So thinking of governments in certain states in Mexico that are not up for election or re-election next year, that have more time to be able to develop a legacy, or states in which there's going to be clear continuity and where it's helpful to be able to give ideas and opinions for the next political cycle. On the next slide, we also discussed a little bit sort of the channels, right? Everything from more indirect channels on the left, how to be involved in press and publications, all the way to the right of actually direct advocacy or sort of a lobby approach, building relationships with key individuals. And so, we also learned, I think, a lot from this process that we weren't starting from zero. Many of our members and the NAB itself had a lot of relationships coming in. And so this spurred a very good discussion of how do we use that, right? How do we build from that? What are some of the comparative advantages that we can bring to the table by engaging in these ways? And on slide 33 is just some examples of quotes that came out from interviews. I think one interesting one that was really that really jumped out to me is one of the more direct ones, but not direct advocacy with key individuals, but actually working with other development partners. So thinking about you know, multilateral institutions that are active in emerging markets, even in developed countries. How can we work with, you know, their agendas and what they're doing, and their convening power that they have to bring policymakers to the table around many of the same priorities. And so as a sort of result of all this research, just on the next page, we you know, arrived to what we call sort of action lines, right? Which is putting together the social problem that we want to make sure helps open the door to discourse, the key needs that we want to put on the table, and say these are ways in which we can advance and evolve the impact ecosystem in the country, and these are the channels and the actors through which we want to have these conversations. And that produced essentially on this next page a set of action lines, a set of ideas, all the way from top to down. And I'll pass it to Itziar shortly to talk us through a little bit sort of where you know, where this has left us, but essentially a set of priorities, everything from, you know, direct instruments that we'd want to impact on the top, results-based payment schemes, to regulatory changes, like tax incentives for impact investors, or regulations which allow for the resource management, the financial management of impact investors to be more flexible, to all the way to the bottom, actual, you know, education or training programs that help build capacity and help build technical sustainability within government institutions. And so this is a combination of some actions were federal, some were more state or municipal, and some are those where we actually realized, hey, it may not be really useful for our NAB to take this on just by itself, right? Or to start this from zero. These are maybe some initiatives that we could lead and that we could develop maybe specific campaigns around, action teams internally. These are some that align very closely with advocacy initiatives of other players in the impact ecosystem on which we can support and we can jump on. And so I'll pass it to Itziar to take us just through sort of the next page and walk through sort of where we've landed. But before I do so, Fabiola, any sort of reflections from you as well about sort of this process and what it allowed for?
Thank you, Marcos. I think I will just say it was really great opportunity to facilitate this process, and our role was mostly that. I think it was really a good example of co-creation. We have a very active membership in the NAB in Mexico. And I also think this process started some conversations about really kind of maybe refining what we want the NAB to achieve. What is the role that all of us in the NAB can play for that, and how all the different activities, not just the policy line, play together. So I feel like if we think back a few months back, ITSI has really been able to use this process and strengthen the NAB significantly over the last few months. And we have a very engaged and very motivated chapter and members doing this. So I really think there was a lot of co-creation in the process, a lot of participation. And the idea was that this will reflect everyone's priorities, and these activities will play to what other actors in the sector needed and were looking for. So I think it was a good process, and the NAB, I will say, kind of is stronger now, not just for this process, but because of the very active participation. But I'll pass it on to Itzi now.
Thank you, Fabiola and Marcos. As you can see, it was a really interesting process that, as Fabiola said, not only give us this amazing strategy that Marcos and Fabiola work, but also it strengthened the NAB, and it led us to to engage in a better way the members. So after all this process that Marcos and Fabiola already mentioned and explained in a really clear way, we passed to the second stage, let's say, of the process, and using a survey and working meetings with all the members. These 7 lines that Marcos mentioned were narrowed down to 4 actionable work streams. So we create, in order to work and to push and to see how we can define next steps in each of these working lines, we created 3 working groups for each of these. For the first one, that it's the promote result-based placement schemes, we have done some webinars to generate. I just want to tell you what have we done after that we define these 3 action lines, and how we are trying to get the members engage and be part of the work that we want to do in the policy, in the public policy. So we have done some webinars to generate awareness about this kind of instruments with Ethos, that it's a policy think tank of public policy, and other members of our NAB. In this, we are like agitators, as Seb already mentioned, about this kind of instrument, and we have been talking with some states teams to explore whether there is will to work together in this team. In the second, in the other line that we define as priority, the B1, support the advocacy for 30-day payment, we define that the Alianza would work a support role. So we have been working with the ASEM to see whether we can help them to push this topic with the legislation area. In the third one, for the social impact measurement government project via training for technical team, that is the other action line that the Alianza we are working to lead. It's we are working in a guide for impact measurement, and we did some training for the Ministry of Economy that hopefully will do, and hopefully we'll do some with the local government that have expressed interest in this topic. This work, I see it, as Marcos said as well, as seeds that in hopefully medium term or short term will lead us to something deeper, and maybe establish some like unit specialized in measurement within the government. So let's see how it goes. And the third one, create political will and understanding of benefits of impact investing in economic recovery. We have been working to generate research and dialogue with public sector. As part of the strategy, in November, we will launch the Summit for Impact Investing, where government will have an important role. So these are like some of the action that we have been done, and some of the things that we have been working with our members. One of the main learnings that I could say, it's like, I guess, like as the Mexican NAB, all your NABs have a really rich and important members, and using their knowledge, work and experience can lead you to amazing works. I really I strongly invite you to be part of this initiative, even though it might look tough at the beginning. To create this strategy, we didn't know how to start. The guidance and support of Sebastian and his team lend. It was like the missing piece that we needed to achieve this, that it's a really important guide, and has been like the guide that we needed to start working with the public sector. So thank you very much, and I pass to Sebastian.
Thank you, Itzi. Thank you so much, Marcos, Fabiola, for everything. Just a final comment before we hear from the group. Well, listening to you again, and the clarity with which you presented. I wanted just to highlight 2 or 3 things. One is, as we work to prioritize the social issues and identify them, Marcos talked about resources from the UNDP in the different countries. I want to emphasize that this is a very valuable resource. You know, there is no need to start from scratch or to reinvent the wheel in all these things. There are secondary data that Mexico used very cleverly to do something very thorough, but very fast as well. So the UNDP is doing that. The UNDP in some of the countries is working on market intelligence mapping. So all of those resources are quite interesting. And obviously, you know, the development priorities of the countries a bit shaken by COVID, but the SDGs are the framework, and most countries, if not all of them in this call, would have an appointed office, an appointed official for SDG alignment and the implementation of the 2030 agenda. The other thing that is very important is that when you look at the Mexican NAB, all the members are very senior on their own right. They are all doing great work. They are all very well plugged. And I guess that, you know, my interpretation is that by doing this kind of collective action, the power of the group starts to emerge, which is way bigger, for obvious it may sound, it's way bigger than the addition of all the individualities. So as long as the group or the different NABs are able to develop a collective voice, which is greater than all the individualities, that is very powerful. I mean, I'm being for so many years on the other side of the desk. It's very different when someone representing one fund or one company or one consultancy or one university approaches you to promote something. You look at them very differently if there is a movement coming together with no specific agenda that benefits one of them in particular. And I guess the act of grandness and generosity is that we were in those sessions where the Mexican NAB prioritized the efforts. And you see that people were supporting this or that based on what was best for the movement in Mexico, not what was best for their particular entity. So perhaps, yeah, I mean, those priorities were not very much aligned with what their financial institution was doing, but there was an honest understanding prioritizing that was what the country needs at this particular time. So I think that exercise is very important. It can only be done brokered by this group, and it adds to the credibility. It also creates identity, and I think it helps for the NABs to come together stronger, united behind a common objective and a common strategy. Now the challenge, of course, is how to drive action based on that. So we'll stay tuned to see what happens with all of this. Just to close from our end, this is a bit how we worked this year. Today we talked about Mexico, but I also want to thank very especially folks in Brazil who couldn't join today, Zambia who's on the call, South Africa, Spain, Laura, and Jose, for being great partners. We did also intense work with all of them, and also supporting a bit more lightly, and hopefully we'll get engaged more closely with Colombia, one of our newest NABs, and Bangladesh. Today we have Juan and Tasvir there. So moving on to the next ones and the following ones, we can skip the next one, which describes more or less the process and how long it took. Laura, if we can move forward to the next, and then the next, and then the next. So essentially, what we want to do today is to invite all of you, the ones who are today on the call live and the ones who weren't able to join and will see this recording or see this slide deck if you're watching this video. And if you think that, you know, your NAB is interested in taking this seriously, and if you think your NAB wants to get closer to the policy space, we think is very important, but you know, it's essentially up to each NAB to prioritize what they want to push forward. We are here. Available to keep working with you, creating a new cohort of what we call this impact policy champion NABs. What is different now is that the first generation of policy champion NABs really made not only a big effort, but it was a big commitment of faith and trust, because yeah, we had a concept note about what we wanted to do, but we didn't have this so clearly defined. So all of them were brilliant guinea pigs that not only trusted but also helped us shape the initiative. And it will continue to evolve because it's not perfect, but I guess that the ones who are signing up to work together from now are in a better place, because you're kind of joining something that has been tested with the good, the bad. It's not all being roses, but I guess it's very powerful how we were able to adapt to the shocks this year, because when COVID arose, obviously we were all shocked around late February, March, but then all the participants said, well, no, this is more important than ever. And it was a tricky year to engage with government and government officials, because obviously there were priorities were somewhere else. But even so, all the countries managed to endure and to sustain the momentum. And I think all of them will be better placed to start approaching now their governments as the water starts to come down and there is more breathing space, and we think about recovery. So I think that was very, very powerful, that the thing didn't collapse because of the crisis. All the NABs kept their heads down and kept engaging. Also very interesting how they linked these things to their annual events. Well, Mexico now is having their annual event in a few days. Spain had a brilliant annual event. Brazil is organizing their annual event soon. So linking these strategies to the national forums, fora that these countries are pushing is also very interesting. Now, just to mention things that perhaps, and this is the final message, that didn't work so well. This initiative makes it super clear that we are one team. I mean, one team of a number of people in the central unit and all of you in the NABs. And that, for us at the central team to think that we can push something, that we can drive change centrally is wrong. I mean, it won't happen, never. We won't be able to understand the realities of your countries, institutional arrangements of your countries, never, ever. So we can support with things like this, but it's really the NABs who drive action, must drive action. So I guess when we try to do too much from the central team, we failed. When we found an empowered, determined partner, like in Mexico and in the other countries, it worked. So I guess that's a big learning.